In the year 298 of the Christian era, through the dusty streets of Rome, a man walked toward his most horrific destiny. His hands were bound, and around him a crowd gathered to witness, something that few had seen, and even fewer would forget. This would not be an ordinary hanging, nor even a crucifixion. What was about to happen was so bizarre, so profoundly disturbing that even the Romans accustomed to the brutality of the Colosseum games would be shocked. The man's name was Marcus Aurelius Clemens, and his crime was the most unforgivable in Roman society. Patrice, the murder of his own father. For this act, he would face the poena, literally translated as the sack of death, a punishment so strange and cruel that it defies modern comprehension. But how did Rome come to create an execution that involved sewing a living man into a leather sack alongside a venomous snake, a wild rooster, a rabid dog, and a monkey? The story of the poena. Kuhl takes us back to the darkest origins of Roman justice, when the line between law and horror became dangerously thin. During the reign of Emperor Diocletian in the full 3rd century of the Christian era, Rome had become an empire that governed through calculated terror, where punishment was not just about justice but about public spectacle that would reinforce imperial authority. Petride was considered by the Romans as the most abominable violation of natural order. For them, killing one's own father was not merely a crime against an individual, but an offense against the gods, against nature, and against the very structure of Roman society. The father was the absolute authority in the family, and his death at the hands of a son represented the complete collapse of the social hierarchy that held Rome together. Marcus Aurelius Clemens had grown up on the Aventine Hills, son of a prosperous merchant who had become wealthy, selling spices brought from the east, but the family's wealth concealed dark secrets. Marco's father, Lucius Clemens, was known for his extreme cruelty. He regularly beat slaves to death and treated his own son as little more than property. For years, Marco endured public humiliations, brutal beatings, and the constant threat of being disinherited. The final straw came in the year 297 during a feast in honor of the god Bacchus. Lucius, drunk and furious over a commercial transaction that had gone wrong, publicly accused Marco of stealing from the family treasury. In front of dozens of guests, he ordered slaves to strip and whip his adult son as if he were a disobedient child. The humiliation was complete, and something broke in Marco's mind at that moment. 3 months later, during another of his drinking binges, Lucius Clemens was found dead in his private library, poisoned with yew extract. The evidence against Marco was overwhelming. Slaves witnessed violent arguments between father and son, and Marco had been seen purchasing the poison from a Syrian healer known for selling lethal substances. Marco's trial was conducted by the prefect of Rome himself, a man named Gaius Valerius Maximus, known for his cruelty and his extremely rigid interpretation of Roman law. During the proceedings, which lasted only 3 days, it became clear that Marco would be condemned. Rome's laws were merciless when it came to patricide, and the penalty was invariably death in the most humiliating way possible. The sentence was pronounced with all the solemnity that Roman law required. Marco would be executed through the poena, a punishment that had been codified decades earlier during the reigns of previous emperors. But the execution would not happen immediately. First, Marco would have to undergo a ritual of degradation that would symbolically transform him from a Roman citizen into something less than human. On the day before the execution, Marco was taken to the Roman Forum, where he was forced to kneel before a statue of Emperor Diocletian. There, in front of hundreds of spectators, his garments were torn and burned, symbolizing his expulsion from civilized society. His head was covered with a red linen sack, the color of shame and betrayal, and he was forced to remain kneeling for hours while citizens passed by and spat on him. The preparation for the poena was an elaborate process that required several days of planning. The executioners first had to capture the animals that would accompany Marco in his death. A venomous viper captured in the hills around Rome, a wild rooster known for its aggressiveness, a dog that had been deliberately provoked to rage, and a monkey that had been kept in captivity to make it more violent and unpredictable. The sack itself was a work of macabre, art made of oxhide, specially treated to be water-resistant yet flexible enough to allow movement. Measuring approximately 6 ft in length by 412 ft in width, it was sewn with animal gut ropes that would become tighter when wet. The interior was smeared with substances that would irritate the skin and increase the desperation of the confined animals. The choice of animals was not random. Each had a specific symbolic meaning in the execution. The snake represented the treachery and poison that Marco had used to kill his father. The rooster symbolized the paternal vigilance that had been violated. The dog represented the family loyalty that had been broken. And the monkey, considered by the Romans as a grotesque parody of humanity, symbolized how Marco had degraded himself to the level of a wild beast. On the morning of the execution, Rome awakened, shrouded in an atmosphere of morbid expectation. Crowds began gathering on the banks of the Tiber River even before sunrise, eager to witness a spectacle that rarely occurred. Street vendors appeared to sell food and drink, transforming the execution into a kind of macabre festival. Marco was brought from the Mamertine prison in a special cart, surrounded by Taurian guards in polished armor. His appearance was shocking. Weeks of confinement had left him gaunt and pale, and his eyes showed signs of the madness that often precedes particularly cruel executions. He had stopped speaking days before, communicating only through incoherent moans. The execution site was carefully chosen, a wooden platform built over a shallow section of the Tiber, where the flowing water would carry the sack away from the city, but not so quickly that spectators could not observe the initial stages of death. The platform was decorated with imperial banners and statues of the gods, transforming the location into an improvised amphitheater of death. The animals were brought in separate cages, each already showing signs of agitation and aggression. The viper, a particularly venomous species found in the mountainous regions of Italy, hissed constantly, its forked tongue testing the air for threats. The rooster, a large muscular specimen with spurs sharp as razors, beat its wings furiously against the bars of its prison. The dog, deliberately starved for days and provoked to a state of near insane rage, foamed at the mouth and threw itself against the walls of its cage with enough force to make the entire structure shake. And the monkey, perhaps the most disturbing of all the animals, emitted sharp, desperate cries that echoed over the crowd like an omen of horror. The moment of execution arrived when the sun reached its zenith. Marco was forced to stand naked before the crowd, a final humiliation before facing his death. His body, marked by weeks of confinement, showed evident signs of malnutrition and despair. He tried to speak, perhaps to make a final statement or plea, but his voice had been reduced to little more than a hoarse whisper. The process of placing him in the sack was conducted with brutal efficiency by the executioners, experienced men who had perfected their technique in previous executions. Marco was forced to enter the sack, which was then partially sewn, leaving only an opening at the top. The first animal to be introduced was the viper, which immediately began searching for an exit, its tongue touching Marco's naked body. The rooster came next, its sharp claws immediately scratching Marco's skin as it beat its wings in panic. The muffled screams coming from inside the sack made the crowd roar with approval. The dog was third, and its presence transformed the atmosphere inside the sack into pure chaos. Furious barks mixed with Marco's screams and the sounds of the other animals in a symphony of terror. Finally, the monkey was pushed into the sack, and the opening was quickly sewn shut. What followed was indescribable. The sack writhed and thrashed violently as the animals, all in a state of absolute panic, attacked anything within reach. The screams coming from inside were of a quality that transcended normal human experience, a mixture of terror, pain, and despair that made even some of the more robust spectators turn away. For several agonizing minutes, the sack continued to move, each movement accompanied by sounds that would haunt the dreams of spectators for years afterward. Gradually, the movements became less violent, but not because the suffering had diminished. The animals, like Marco, were beginning to succumb to confinement, suffocating heat, and mutual injuries. Finally, the sack was pushed into the river. It floated for a few moments on the surface, still moving weakly before beginning to sink slowly. The crowd watched in absolute silence as the murky waters of the Tiber swallowed the sack, and its horrible contents carrying Marcus Aurelius Clemens to his watery grave. But the death of Publius Malololus did not mark the end of the poena cullei story. This form of execution would continue to be used sporadically throughout the Roman period, always reserved for cases of patricide, considered particularly heinous. Each execution followed the pattern established by Malololus: public degradation, symbolically significant animals, and death by drowning in a leather sack. The practice would persist until the year 534 of the Christian era, when Emperor Justinian finally included it in the Corpus Juris Civilis, codifying it for posterity before its gradual disappearance. The horror of the poena cullei lay not only in its cruelty, but in its psychologically calculated nature. The execution was designed not just to kill, but to completely destroy the condemned person's human dignity, reducing them to the level of a wild beast fighting for survival. It was a total denial of the victim's humanity, a symbolic transformation from person to thing. The effectiveness of the poena cullei as a deterrent is questionable. While it certainly caused terror among the population, it also fed a culture of violence and dehumanization that may have contributed to other social problems in the Roman Empire. Normalized public brutality may have desensitized the population to other forms of cruelty, creating a vicious cycle of ever-increasing violence. Historical documentation about specific poena cullei executions is limited, partly because many records were lost, but also because even by Roman standards, these executions were considered extraordinarily brutal. Most references come from legal sources that describe the procedure in technical terms, or from later authors who wrote about the practice. With horror and fascination, the gradual disappearance of the poena coincided with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. The first Christian emperors, although they still practiced public executions, found this particular form of death incompatible with their new religious beliefs. The practice was officially abolished in the year 386 of the Christian era during the reign of Emperor Theodosius the Great. The story of the death sack serves as a disturbing reminder of how far human societies can go when justice becomes theater and punishment transforms into spectacle. It represents a moment in history when the thirst for revenge overcame any consideration of humanity or dignity, creating a form of execution that was both ritual and torture. What you have just heard is not the documented account of one specific man, but a dramatization inspired by the actual executions recorded by the Romans. The first historical case we know of is that of Publius Malololus in the year 101 before Christ, condemned for killing his own mother and documented by Cicero himself. From that terrible precedent, the penalty of the poena cullei would become the symbol of Rome's most heinous crime, perpetuating itself for centuries, until disappearing definitively in the year 534 of the Christian era, when Emperor Justinian included it in the Corpus Juris Civilis. Today, when we look back at practices like the poena, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the limits of acceptable punishment. Temporal distance may make us feel superior to the ancient Romans, but the human capacity for cruelty, especially when sanctioned by the state, remains a constant concern in all eras. The execution of Marcus Aurelius Clemens and the horrors of the death sack remind us that civilization is always a thin veneer over more primitive impulses, and that constant vigilance is necessary to prevent modern societies from sliding into similar barbarisms. The story of the poena cullei is not just about ancient Rome, but about the dark potential that exists within all human cultures.